Hey everybody, it's Randy Ray. This is the Literate Texan, and this is my weekly wrap-up for the week ending August the 2nd. Normally when I do these weekly wrap-ups, and I have not been consistent about doing weekly wrap-ups at all, but I'm going to start being more consistent because I think they're a nice thing to put up every Saturday. But normally, when I've finished up a week of reading, I've generally read between 500 and 600 pages for the week. You know, those aren't huge numbers, but they're okay numbers, and they do all right. Normally, I've got 4, 5, 6, sometimes even 7 or 8 books going on at one time. So I'm not always finishing books every week. Sometimes I'm in the middle of several books at once. This last week, though, I haven't been feeling particularly well, so I basically only read from 2 books, and I only got a couple hundred pages total read. But the interesting thing about these 2 books is that they're wildly different from each other. The first, well, let me just tell you what the 2 books are first. And I don't have cover art for either of them, and I don't have Dead Tree copies of them. I read almost entirely on my Kindle these days because of my vision. It's just gotten to a point where it's really, really hard for me to read anything on paper. And I'm going to see an eye doctor about that soon because, as you can see, I really like books on paper. But the 2 books were The Killer Inside Me by Jim Thompson, which is a hard-boiled crime/detective novel that was originally published in 1952, and I'll have plenty to say about it in just a second. But The Killer Inside Me is one of the 2 books that I read this week. The other book was called Galactic Patrol by E. Doc Smith, and that was published in 1937, and it was part of my attempt at doing something for Rocket Summer. Okay, so these books couldn't be more wildly different. One of them, you know, The Killer Inside Me, is set in the past. Now, it wasn't set in the past at the time it was published. It was set in the present day, but it might as well have been set in the past. You know, it's set in 1952 in a dusty West Texas town, and there are going to be some minor spoilers in here, although the spoilers happen so quickly in the book that it almost doesn't matter. But basically what The Killer Inside Me about is a sheriff's detective named Lou Ford, who's really polite and kind of charming in his slowpoke, aphoristic. He's always talking in aphorisms like, you know, don't cry over spilled milk, you know, little sayings like that, which makes him exceedingly dull as a person, which he uses to his advantage occasionally. But that's his front. That's what he looks like to the world. Inside, he's a psychopathic killer, and you learn that more as the book goes along. So it's a really dark book about a dark villain. It's almost not even a crime novel. It's almost a more apt description of The Killer Inside Me would be to call it a psychological horror novel. Now, I have more to say about that in a minute, but just to give you an idea of how different it is, Galactic Patrol by E. Smith from 1937. So instead of being set in the past, it's set in the future, okay? And it's not about a villain or a dark character that's psychologically wounded or crazy like Lou Ford is. It's about a hero. And the main character, what's his name? I can never remember his name. It's alliteristic. The main character's named, it's got a K in it somewhere. This is why I take notes, but I can't always find the notes here. So where is the guy's name? Kinsman, something like that? Kimball Kinnison, like Sam Kinison. Kimball Kinnison is the main character in Galactic Patrol. And he's a hero. He's sort of like a Buck Rogers combined with Captain Kirk type hero, but he's also really nerdy. He's like Buck Rogers or Captain Kirk if they constantly carried a slide rule around with them. Tricorders would probably make the slide rule obsolete, but at the time this was written, you know, it's pretty easy to recognize him. But it reminds me a lot of, anyway, he's a shining example of a great hero way off in space in a bright, brilliant future. And there's some good versus evil there. Now, I want to go into detail a little bit more about each novel, even though I haven't finished them. The Killer Inside Me by Jim Thompson, I've read before. I used to own a bookstore, and most people know that my bookstore had a horror theme. And we had a monthly book club there where we let the members choose the books. And one of the tools we used to find great horror to read were these 2 anthologies. They weren't really anthologies. They were books that basically consisted of top 100 moments in horror books. And the editor had gone out to various quote-unquote horror experts, authors, editors, that sort of thing, and asked them to write a chapter for him. So it's got 100 chapters in it with 100 great horror moments from 100 different authors. And there were 2 volumes of this. I can't remember the name of those particular books, but The Killer Inside Me had a moment in it that was suggested, so we did it as one of our books for the book club. And I remember nobody really liked it very much. Jim Thompson is a pretty well thought of author, especially among Hollywood. A lot of his books have been made into movies, including The Killer Inside Me, which was made into a movie shortly after we read it. But Jim Thompson also wrote a book called The Grifters, which was also made into a film. And what was the other one? There was one that I read recently by Jim Thompson. Oh, The Getaway. Jim Thompson wrote The Getaway, which has a wonderful final chapter that isn't in either of the novels. And you can look back through my past videos to find my review of The Getaway. Or you could just search in the Google toolbar. Just go in there and type in The Getaway and then Literate Texan. And it should pull right up for you. But anyway, set in 1952. I've got some notes about it here so I don't forget anything. Okay. The first thing I wrote on here was chilling noir novel. Noir is French for black. It's also a term that's used to describe certain types of film. I always think of film noir before I think of literature that would be described as noir, but this is definitely noir. One of the characteristics of a noir novel or a movie is that it has a dreamlike quality, and it's often told in first person as a flashback, which is pretty much what we get here with The Killer Inside Me. Lou Ford, the main character, is the narrator, and he is telling the story in flashback, okay? So, but anyway, at first, when you meet Lou Ford, the main character, you think, okay, he's a little off. You know, we all have that awkward friend or a couple of awkward friends or a couple of awkward acquaintances we know that don't have very good social skills necessarily, but they're just awkward. They're just a little offbeat. And that's what you think of Lou Ford at first. But it doesn't take very long as you read the novel to realize this guy isn't just a little bit awkward. He's not just a little bit weird. This guy's evil. And this guy's really good at covering up and hiding that evil. So he's one of the best examples of a literature trope called the unreliable narrator that I've ever seen. If I were ever to teach a literature class where we discussed the unreliable narrator, this would be at the top of my list, or close to the top of my list, as something to read as an example of that, okay? So, anyway, Lou Ford, main character. Let's see here. Voice. So the violence in this book is largely hidden beneath a patina of small town Texas politeness. If you've never been to Texas, you might not have experienced this for yourself, especially if you've never been to West Texas. But the action is set in a small West Texas town, and they have their own way of talking, their own way of doing things, and they've got a certain code of conduct, a certain etiquette that they follow all the time. And even though Lou Ford is horrifically evil, he's really good at playing the small town polite thing as a means of defending himself, as a means of looking innocent. Okay, so that's what I've got there. And then there's one part of the book where they actually go to Fort Worth, which was pretty exciting because, you know, most people think of Fort Worth as being the start of West Texas, but these guys are so far west that they've come back. But you could also think of The Killer Inside Me as being really similar to American Psycho. The main difference is the setting. American Psycho, if I'm not mistaken, I know American Psycho has an urban setting in the business world. I don't know that necessarily it's set in New York or Chicago or Los Angeles. I don't remember it that well. It's been a while since I've read it, and it's been even longer since I've seen the movie. But, you know, you take that setting and you transplant that character, this overtly polite, nice guy that you would like, and put him into a small Texas town in 1952, make him super polite and likable, but also this vicious, psychotic killer. And that's what you've got. You've got a Texas version of American Psycho. So I'm going to recommend it. If it sounds like something you'd be interested in, it probably will be something you're interested in. At the time that it was published in 1952, it was even a little dark and violent and grim for the time period then. And over time, it's become sort of iconic in terms of its depiction of that sort of thing. And but let's contrast that with the other book that I read. The other book that I read, of course, being Galactic Patrol. And it is, like I say, completely on the other side of the galaxy, literally and figuratively, okay? It's real pulpy. It's a science fiction novel from E. Doc Smith, and he has the nickname Doc Smith because he actually has a PhD, and I believe the author had a PhD in physics, but I wouldn't swear to that, okay? But he throws in a lot of technological and science jargon, so be prepared for that. It's a little distracting to me, and I don't much like it, but it's also a real page turner. It's almost like you've got an adventure that was written specifically for someone who's in the Boy Scouts of America who also really likes science fiction or space opera. The thing is, it was written in 1937, so this was a long time before the space opera that we think of. It was hugely influential on two types of space opera that, well, more than just these two types of space opera, but the ones that most people compare it to is, the first thing they compare it to is Green Lantern. The Galactic Patrol is about a character who joins a group called the Lensmen. And the Lensmen are people who can attune themselves to a particular type of crystal that can only be found on a certain planet, and it gives them special powers that allow them to become part of this intergalactic force that enforces the law. And I don't know how much Green Lantern you've read, but that's exactly what it is. It's an intergalactic police force that enforces the law. The big difference is that the Green Lantern Corps' powers come from a ring rather than a lens, and the powers that they get are different. The Lensmen get powers that are related to their psi abilities or their ESP abilities. They can read minds, and they even have a certain amount of mind control. Okay, the ring in Green Lantern, on the other hand, it uses the user's willpower to create, physical constructs that don't last. Okay, so there's a big difference there. The other one that they make a lot of comparisons to is the Lensman series is also often compared and contrasted with Star Wars. The big difference being that, well, let's talk about the similarities first. The big similarities is both series are about huge galactic wars of good versus evil. They're pretty black and white. One of the big differences is that the characters in the Lensman series are basically kind of stock characters. They're not well-rounded characters at all. These books are more about the events and the action than they are about the characters and the characters' behavior. Star Wars, there's a little more characterization going on. Luke Skywalker, Anakin Skywalker, Obi-Wan Kenobi, these guys all have really distinct personalities, whereas the characters in the Lensman, you could replace one with the other fairly easily without too much trouble. Those are the two that I usually see comparing them, but I am reminded of a book called The Old Man's War by John Scalzi, which I happen to love, and it's considered part of a military science fiction subgenre. So it's a descendant of books like The Forever War by Joe Haldeman and Starship Troopers by Robert A. Heinlein. All three of those books are very similar, and all three of them also are very reminiscent of the Lensman series. So, you can look for that while you're reading it and say, oh, yeah, that reminds me of this, and this reminds me of that, and it can be a lot of fun. But the one thing about Galactic Patrol, it's even more fast-paced than those two novels, and it's like you took a really fast-paced pulp novel and in half of a physics textbook and kind of spliced it in there and stapled the physics stuff in there at random. That's how I would describe it. So if that sounds cool to you, then great. It has a certain charm to it, but I'm not crazy about it. I certainly liked Old Man's War a lot better, and honestly, I'm enjoying The Killer Inside Me more than I'm enjoying Galactic Patrol. It might be that this kind of space opera is more fun for a certain type of reader that's just not my type of reader, that's just not me. So let me see if I'm leaving anything out with my notes. No, that's about it, okay? So that's it. I don't have a lot to talk about this week because I haven't read very much this week. But I'm reading 2 books, and I'll have more books that I've read this coming week for sure, because I didn't read much last week, and it wouldn't be possible to read much less than I did. So, but this week, I've got a dark crime novel about the banality of evil on one hand, and then on the other hand, I've got this sweeping space opera pulp novel that I'm reading. So at least when I'm switching from one to the other, I'm not bored. Anyway, I'll be back with another video soon. I'm expecting in August to have a really productive month in terms of videos that I'm publishing. I hope that's okay with everybody. If it's not, I guess you don't have to watch the videos. Although I hope you will. I hope you're enjoying what I have to say. Most people seem to like my channel. And I'm going to close in the usual manner, but I'm going to ask you to forgive me because I've got the hiccups all of a sudden. But yeah, if you've watched my channel before, then you probably already know that I'm going to tell you to stay sexy, folks. But I'm also going to tell you, and this is even more important, stay hydrated. I'll see you in the next video, and I thank you for watching.